earthly way of life of a nation, including not only the morals of the nation, but also the science, the arts, government, education, entertainment, and family life. Roughly, by culture is meant what we have in mind by everyday earthly life in the world. Culture, in the theory of common grace, refers to all of life apart from church life, all of life excepting public worship, doctrinal confession of the truth, prayer, and related spiritual activities. Kuyper was convinced that the Reformed people in the Netherlands at his time slighted culture and the cultural calling that they shared with all Netherlanders. Indeed, Kuyper expressed the fear that the Reformed people spurned culture and rejected the cultural calling of the Christian altogether. Kuyper's code word for this perceived evil was Anabaptism, with reference to certain Baptists in Reformation times who withdrew physically from earthly society and tried to live in physical separation from the ungodly world. These Baptists cared only for the spiritual condition of their souls. Their position, their viewpoint, was expressed by the Dutch proverb, met een boekje in een hoekje, which is roughly translated, with a little spiritual book in a little corner. That was their estimation of the Christian life. And that, said Kuyper, was the danger for Reformed Christians in his day. He charged that many Reformed Christians restricted their calling as Christians to a good, active church life, ignoring and even repudiating an equally vigorous Christian life in society and in all areas of human culture. Kuyper wanted to influence the culture in such an effective way as to make the culture Christian. He and Bavinck coined the term for this activity, quote, Christianizing, end quote, the culture. Herman Bavinck wrote on one occasion, quote, we have to aim at that mighty, glorious, rich ideal to Christianize the world, end quote. But by Christianize, Kuyper and Bavinck did not mean that the life of the nation becomes truly Christian. That is, that the life of a nation would be a life lived by a majority of citizens who are born again and believers in Jesus Christ, living a life of love for God and the neighbor from the heart, in accordance with the 10 Commandments of the law. Not at all. That is not at all what they meant by Christianizing the Netherlands and the world. Kuyper was well aware that already in his day, the majority of citizens of the Netherlands were and would always be unregenerated, unsaved unbelievers who did not love God and who did not keep the commandments out of love for God. But by the Christianizing of the culture, Kuyper meant a certain influence of Christianity on the culture, so that outwardly the everyday earthly life of the citizens conformed somewhat to Christian standards. And the life of a society, according to Kuyper, if it was Christianized, would so outwardly conform because the citizens, even though mostly unbelievers, had a certain regard for and delight in Christianity and its way of life. On this crucial point, what Kuyper meant by Christianizing the Netherlands, I must let Kuyper himself speak. Hear Kuyper on what he meant by Christianizing his nation. I'm not going to give the reference for this quotation or the reference for the other quotations I make in this speech in the interests of time, but I have these references noted, and if anyone wants proof and validation of the quotations, he or she is free to ask me for this validation. I quote Kuyper, "Christian," in the phrase Christianizing the nation, Christian says nothing about the spiritual state of the inhabitants of such a country, but only witnesses to the fact that public opinion, the general mindset, the ruling ideas, the moral norms, the laws and customs there clearly betoken the influence of the Christian faith. End of quote. According to Kuyper himself, therefore, a Christianized nation is a society and nation that still lies in the darkness of idolatry, unbelief, and unrighteousness, but has become somewhat more decent, moral, and orderly. I would analyze what Kuyper meant by Christianizing this way, that a Christianized nation is one upon which a veneer of Christianity has been applied. I would analyze what he meant by Christianizing that way, were it not for the fact that Kuyper taught that Christianizing a nation also consists of a certain inner spiritual work of grace that improves ungodly persons and an ungodly society. Now, it was this zeal for Christianizing the nation that moved the Christian Reformed Church to adopt the 3 points of common grace in 1924. This zeal for Christianizing the United States and the world is still alive and well in the Christian Reformed Church today. In his August 2014 communication to alumni of Calvin College, of which I am an alumnus and not an unthankful one, President Michael K. Leroy held before us the calling and the prospect of the, and now I quote President Leroy, transformational work of renewing this broken world, end quote. This is the mission of Calvin College, in keeping with the common grace decisions of 1924. This is the Kuyperian project of the Alliance of Reformed Theologians and the Acton Institute today. Note well, in President Leroy's statement, not only the United States, but also, quote, this world, end quote, renewing this broken world. The power that must accomplish this grand, if not grandiose project is the grace of God, but a common grace of God. It must be evident to all here tonight who are not out of their mind that the project of Christianizing the United States of America in AD 2014, to say nothing of the whole world, is a gigantic project. Putting Humpty Dumpty back together again is a piece of cake in comparison with, quote, renewing this broken world, end quote, in President Leroy's words. This is not only because the vast majority of citizens are hardened in anti-Christianity, developed in hatred for Jesus Christ and his godly kingdom, and opposed to everything that even faintly resembles Christianity and Christianity's holy way of life, think for a moment of what would be demanded only of renewing the sexual culture of the United States of America. But the project of Christianizing the United States is enormous also because, as Paul writes in 2 Corinthians 4, verse 4, Satan is the god of this world. And as John writes in 1 John 5, verse 19, quote, the whole world lieth in wickedness, end of quote. The possibility and power of Christianizing the world, according to Kuyper and his contemporary disciples, is the common grace of God. Given Kuyper's project, nothing less than making this wicked, Satan-dominated, and world-controlled world Christian, we must appreciate Kuyper's affirmation that only a grace of God can accomplish the project. Mere human goodwill and effort cannot Christianize the world. Not even the cooperation of the two mighty religious forces, Calvinism and the Roman Catholic Church, can Christianize the world. Only the grace of God could conceivably Christianize the world. Grace, which is always both God's favor or love toward a certain object and God's power at work to bless and to do good to that object that is loved by God. Indeed, since according to Orthodox Christianity, God is his perfections, the grace of God is God himself in his favor and power. According to Kuyper and his disciples, within and without Reformed churches, God himself is at work, Christianizing the world out of an attitude of love and by his divine power. But what is this common grace of God that supposedly accomplishes the miraculous Christianizing of the world? Let us be clear. It is a grace of God. It is divine. It is nothing other and nothing less than the loving and almighty being of God in a particular revelation of this being, and as engaged in a certain extremely important work in history. But this grace is common. It is different from the special particular grace of God that saves sinners from their sin and death and that causes them to live a holy life out of grateful love to God, who saved and saves them in Jesus Christ by his Spirit. How Kuyper hammered on this point, that common grace differs essentially from particular saving grace. How Kuyper warned against confusing the two graces, with the result that common grace would morph in the thinking of Reformed churches and people into the universal, ineffectual grace of semi-Pelagianism and Arminianism. Here, only by heroic effort do I restrain myself from exposing the first point of common grace of the Christian Reformed Church of 1924 as un-Kuyperian. That first point is we charge unbiblical and unreformed creedally, but it is also un-Kuyperian. It fails to distinguish the saving grace of God from this purported common grace of God. As part of his futile endeavor to differentiate two graces of God, Kuyper even gave common grace a different name in his Dutch language from saving particular grace. He called his common grace gratie, in distinction from genade. Genade referred to saving grace. Gratie was supposed to refer to common grace. According to Kuyper, this common grace, or gratie in Dutch, is common because God gives this grace or bestows this grace upon all humans without exception. God bestows this common grace upon the worst reprobate, unbelieving, idolatrous, and depraved sinner, as well as upon the elect, believing, holy child of God. This common grace does not save anybody. That is reserved for the particular grace that God has only for the elect. But it is a genuine love of God for all humans, and a real power of divine blessing within and upon all humans. If this common grace does not save sinners, what does it do to sinners, even the worst of them, we ask? Kuyper's answer is, since this is a grace of God, it must accomplish and be intended by God to accomplish something worthwhile, something impressive, something that is glorifying of God. Common grace produces the cultural achievements of the human race. Shakespeare's plays, Beethoven's symphonies, Houseman's poetry, and Patrick O'Brien's novels, as well as the philosophy of the pagans Confucius and Plato. Basic to these cultural accomplishments is a certain order and decency in society, the society of a nation, and ultimately the society of the entire world. This order is also the work of God's common grace. Here, at this crucial point in which we identify common grace and its work, I must let Kuyper himself speak, this time from his little book, Lectures on Calvinism. Quote, "The common grace of God produced in ancient Greece and Rome the treasures of philosophic light and disclosed to us treasures of art and justice. It kindled the love for classical studies," end quote. Richard Mouw is correct when, in his introduction to the first volume of the translation of Kuyper's Common Grace, he describes the power and purpose of common grace as, quote, "bringing the cultural designs of God to completion," end of quote. But these cultural products and prodigies are by no means all that Kuyper had in mind by common grace. He himself distinguished two aspects of common grace, an external and an internal. The external aspect of common grace was God's operations to produce good culture and good order in society. The political theory of the founding fathers of the United States and the musical abilities of the ungodly Mozart. But common grace, according to Kuyper, has also an internal component. It is a gracious work of God within unbelieving, ungodly sinners that does several astounding things. First, it restrains sin in everybody so that they are not totally depraved as otherwise they would be. Second, it preserves in all humans, even the most depraved, some remnants of the image of God in them in which image the race was originally created in Adam, according to Genesis 1 and 2. Some goodness, some genuine goodness, therefore, is still to be found in all humans. Because my controversy tonight is not with Kuyper's lapse from distinctive, fundamental, biblical, and Reformed orthodoxy concerning the gospel of salvation from sin, I merely note here that Kuyper himself was guilty of fundamental departure from the Reformed faith of the canons of Dort, and himself paved the way for his disciples, particularly the Christian Reformed Church in 1924, to develop his doctrine of common grace into a doctrine of universal, ineffectual, saving grace. Kuyper denied total depravity. He denied total depravity by his theology of common grace. In connection with his affirmation of remains in all sinners of the original image of God, Kuyper stated that this remnant of goodness by common grace is the, quote, point of contact, end quote, for the gospel and saving grace. There is, in the fallen sinner, a point of contact for the gospel, some receptivity to the gospel of salvation. It is not surprising, in light of Kuyper's denial of total depravity, that Roman Catholic theologians and thinkers can cooperate with the Kuyper of common grace. Rome, too, teaches that the fall left humans with much goodness, goodness upon which the grace of salvation depends, and goodness that enables a fallen race to produce good culture in the judgment of God. In addition, so Kuyper, common grace enables all humans to do good, not in the realm of salvation, but in the sphere of civil life in society, and with regard to everyday life in the world, in the family, at work, at play, and in the nation. Common grace enables everyone to do real good in this sphere, good in the judgment of God himself, whose grace, after all, produces this good. This common grace and what it does in history are of the greatest importance in the judgment of Abraham Kuyper. The opening words of Kuyper's treatment of common grace in the 3 large volumes are these, I quote, "The Reformed paradigm has suffered no damage greater than its deficient development of the doctrine of common grace," end of quote. That's the importance of common grace to Kuyper and his followers. Common grace is nothing less than a worldview for us Reformed churches and people, according to Kuyper. In light of common grace, we must view and explain the whole world, the history of the world, and our life in the world. Common grace explains the world, its history, and its goal. Common grace is a worldview according to the purpose of God himself, the creator and governor of the world and its history. To ignore or deny common grace, therefore, is deadly serious error, according to Kuyper and his followers. The stakes that the Protestant Reformed, in the controversy that the Protestant Reformed churches have with Kuyper's common grace are high. The issue is fundamental. One last feature of common grace must be mentioned, and the importance of this feature is that it is the reason why Herman Hoeksema and the Protestant Reformed churches, but also other opponents in Kuyper's own day, rejected common grace. This feature is that common grace is supposed to be the ground of the calling of Christians to cooperate with the ungodly in the grand work of Christianizing the world. Christian and non-Christian share the grace of God, the common grace of God, in order to work together to realize one of God's two great purposes for history, making their society, their nation, and then all the world Christian. Reformed Christians share this grace with Roman Catholics, and therefore Calvinists may, can, and must cooperate with Roman Catholics in Christianizing America. Reformed Christians share this grace with the ungodly, and may, can, and must cooperate with the ungodly in Christianizing America. A basic question about this theory and worldview is, what biblical basis does it rest on? There is no basis at all in the Reformed confessions, and Kuyper honestly admitted this, although he saw this as a weakness in the creeds. In light of the supposed importance of common grace for God's very purpose with creation and history, and for the calling of a Christian, this total lack of support in the creeds is significant. Creedal Reformed Christianity knows nothing of a common grace of God, or of a Christianizing of a nation or of the world as the purpose of God. Nothing, absolutely nothing. The only mention of common grace in the Reformed creeds, and there is a mention of it, is the attribution of the teaching to the heretical Arminians in order to condemn common grace as false doctrine. You can find that in the third and fourth heads of the canons, Rejection of Errors, number 5. Although they are loath honestly to admit the absence of a theory and worldview of common grace in the creeds, Reformed Christians and churches today virtually admit this absence by exerting themselves to concoct a creedal basis. The Christian Reformed Synod of 1924 did this by quoting only the first half of Article 4 of the third and fourth heads of doctrine of the canons, which teaches the, quote, glimmerings of natural light, end quote. After the fall, the Christian Reformed Synod of 1924 deliberately failed to quote or heed the second part of the same article, which explicitly denies that fallen human beings are able to use the light of nature rightly, quote, even in things natural and civil, end quote. We might accurately paraphrase, in cultural matters. In fact, the article concludes, I quote, man renders this light of nature wholly polluted and holds it in unrighteousness, by doing which he becomes inexcusable before God, end quote. There is no common grace in this article. What various Reformed churches are doing today is drawing up new contemporary creeds that allow for and even promote common grace and its worldview and the Christianizing of society. I instance the Christian Reformed New Confession, quote, our world belongs to God, end quote. Noticeable in that modern creed is that the worldview of common grace predominates over the worldview of particular grace, if it does not exclude the worldview of particular grace altogether. No man can confess two worldviews, for either he will hate the one and love the other, or else he will hold to the one and despise the other. Ye cannot confess the worldview of particular grace and the worldview of common grace. He had no support in the creeds, but Kuyper thought he had biblical basis for common grace in the covenant with Noah as recorded in Genesis 9. And that's why I asked our chairman to read that passage of Scripture tonight. Genesis 9 and its account of the covenant with Noah after the flood was undoubtedly the main, even fundamental biblical ground for his theory of common grace for Abraham Kuyper. With that covenant with Noah, he began his treatment of common grace in volume 1 of his work on the theory. That beginning by Kuyper is accurately represented in the title of the first volume of the translation of Kuyper's work on common grace into English. The title of this book is Common Grace. The subtitle is Noah to Adam. That must strike you as odd. The explanation is not that the authors or translators or publishers of this work had their chronology confused, supposing that Noah preceded Adam. But in that subtitle is reflected their awareness that the fundamental biblical basis for Abraham Kuyper of his theory of common grace was God's covenant with Noah. The texts that are quoted at the beginning of the first 6 chapters of the book concern Noah and Genesis 9. After extensive, thorough treatment of the covenant with Noah at the beginning of Volume 1, Kuyper returned to this scripture again and again in his 3 volumes on common grace. It is not an exaggeration to say that Kuyper's theory of common grace stands or falls with his understanding of Genesis 9 and the covenant with Noah. Kuyper explains the covenant with Noah in Genesis 9 as strictly a covenant of common grace concerning God's favor to every human as long